All right, two texts today, both from the New Testament. Your next minister may well use names like Greek Testament and Hebrew Testament to refer to the New and the Old Testaments. Old has long been discarded because it's seen as pejorative, and so to talk about the Hebrew Scriptures as old seems like it's a slam. All this time, I've still been wanting to hold up old as something good, and the older I get, the more strongly I feel about that. But don't be surprised if new terminology comes your way. It's time. It's time. So, from the Gospel of John. John, as you may know, is very different from the other Gospels. No less truthful, but truthful in a poetic way. Metaphorical. None of the other three Gospels show Jesus making statements about himself. And in fact, in Mark, when people start figuring out that Jesus is the Messiah, it's a deeply held secret. Don't you dare tell anybody. There are whole books written about the messianic secret in Mark. Remember that phrase, it will make you sound very smart. Now, in John, 7 different times, John makes extraordinary, big truth claims about himself. I am the bread of life, I am the vine, I am the gate, no one comes to God but through me, and so forth. Hard to hold that with the other 3 Gospels unless you understand John in a different way. And I understand it as spiritual, metaphorical, poetic truth. And I do believe that the gate, the vine, the branches, all that, that's how the community understood Jesus. But if you're the kind of Christian who believes the main thing about your faith is what you intellectually believe about Jesus, about who he was and claimed to be, then this statement of his that we're going to hear from John 14, that he said to his disciples at his Last Supper, it might surprise you. Do you love me, he asks? Well, here's what I want you to do. Here's what I want you to do. And even in the Gospel of John, it's not about believe this, believe that. Believe these 7 things about me. All right, now Romans. Romans, the righteous will live by faith. There's a big background to this one. Around 520 years ago, there lived a Roman Catholic priest in Germany whose faith brought him little comfort. The harder he tried, the less comfort it brought him. He tortured himself with feelings of worthlessness, with the question of how to be a good person, how to be right with God. He went on a pilgrimage to Rome, believing he would finally find himself worthy if he did that. 800 miles one way on foot. On his arrival, what did he run into? A building campaign. And behind it, a corrupt church and corrupt church leaders. The Vatican, at that time, in order to raise money, was literally trying to sell forgiveness. They needed a lot of money. They were trying to build St. Peter's Basilica, but they were selling forgiveness. You could buy a certificate called an indulgence, and that would fast-track you through purgatory into heaven. We did not have any indulgences for sale at the auction last night. So he returned home distraught, but willing to go about his business preaching and teaching theology, and then a monk came to town further selling those indulgences. He had a little song he sang, when the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. And that did it. That finished him off. Martin Luther posted his 95 disagreements with the church, called his 95 Theses, on the public door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg. And that was about 504 years, give or take a few today. I should have done the math. Little did he know that the printing press was going to make his 95 Theses go viral. Little did he know he would be tried for heresy, excommunicated, and forced to go into hiding. At some point, while translating, he was in hiding, he was wrestling with his personal unworthiness, he was translating the Bible for himself. His eyes fell on the book of Romans. This verse, chapter 1, it blew his socks off. The righteous shall live by faith. And he took that to mean that righteousness is a gift given by God to those who have faith in Jesus. Christ's death and resurrection have accomplished everything Luther believed. Grace is a gift to you from God when you believe. And he said, when I discovered that, I was reborn. I saw the whole of Scripture in a new light, and the doors of paradise swung open and I walked through. he had intended to reform the church of the day, the Roman Catholic Church, but instead it split apart. And the split has now become splinters. We are one splinter of that original split, which was called the Protestant Reformation. And I believe that another Reformation is underway. And that's what I want to talk about today. So listen for the Spirit of God as Allison reads these two scriptures. Oops, sorry. I don't think it's on. Turn it.
From John. If you love me, you will keep my commandments, and I will ask the Father, and he will give you another advocate to be with you forever. This is the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive because it neither sees him nor knows him. You know him because he abides with you, and he will be in you. And from Romans. For I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for the salvation to everyone who has faith. To the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed through the faith for faith. As it is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith. The word of God for the people of God.
Every 500 years, the church holds a giant garage sale. Or so says Phyllis Tribble, and I think she's right. She's a religious writer who studies these things. Phyllis Tickle. I said the wrong Phyllis. During Luther's Great Reformation, the Protestant churches discarded the limiting ideas of the day and they replaced them. They replaced salvation not by works and what we do alone, but salvation by faith. It's all about what we believe. It's all about how we receive grace. They replaced the centrality of the rigid church hierarchy with the centrality of the Bible. They replaced the ministry of the power of the priests with the ministry of all believers. Now, Roman Catholicism did not die away, but it did drop back and do a lot of important reforming of its own, including spiritual movements, higher education, anti-corruption measures, hooray, and a revival of the Inquisition. A little over 500 years later, guess what the Protestant churches are doing? And by Protestant, I mean the ones that broke away from the Catholic Church all those years ago. What we are doing is holding a giant garage sale. We have been taking out to the curb a great many religious concepts that have outlived their usefulness, are not standing up to scrutiny, and are actually hurting people. Some of them never passed the test of truth in the first place. And not only that, we've been rummaging around in the attic to see what's of use from our past that we might have put away and overlooked. Things that God might want us to be looking at anew. And I think that's good news. Now, of course, to talk about the Protestant church is to talk about a great variety of religious groups, many of whom I think are in the midst of a reformation, many of whom are not. Many of us, I believe, have already undergone a reformation, and some of us are coming out the other side. And I talked about this 2 years ago around this time of year, and I think it's even more important to talk about it today, and I'm even more convinced today that we are coming out the other side of this reformation. I think it's what we've been doing here at Cedar Hills United Church of Christ. Now, unlike Martin Luther, I don't have 95 points to discuss, and that's a good thing. My preaching professor used to say, forget 3 points in a poem, have 3 poems and a point. He would be so shocked at me and ashamed of me. I have 12 points today. I know. But I also wrote them down, copied them off. They're on bright yellow paper out on the table in the narthex. I won't linger on them, but let's put on our roller skates and quickly review them. The 12 pillars of our reform that I think we are already going through. Number 1, we have shifted our concept of God. God is no longer a king or a judge on a throne in heaven looking down on us and judging us. God is around us. God is within us. God is on the horizons calling us forward. We no longer speak of God as exclusively male. That was not true at the beginning of my ministry. We no longer speak of God as exclusively male. We haven't for quite a while. We no longer default to the robed, bewhiskered grandfather in the sky of old-time religion. Not that there's anything wrong with old, bewhiskered grandfathers. But it's a limiting idea for God. And while we no longer speak of that, we also haven't gone as far as many in the New Age spirituality movement who believe God is primarily or only within us, and in fact, God is us. We have not gone there. Our vision of God has expanded, though. God is around us, within us, beyond us. God is on the horizon, calling us forward. God is no longer an object to be believed in intellectually as much as a loving presence to be enveloped in, guided by, and loved in return. When we move beyond a gendered God in our hymns, some of you might remember how unhappy we were with the new hymnal 20-some years ago, where we stopped singing to God as He and started singing to God as you. It was a wonderful thing that accidentally happened in the doing. We stopped singing and praying about God in the third person and started singing to God. And so instead of singing, "All creatures of our God and King, lift up your voice and to Him sing," we were singing, "To you, O God, all creatures sing. And all creation, everything, we sing your praises, alleluia." So we were singing to God instead of about God. A wonderful shift. Suddenly God was here instead of there. Number 3, we've come to understand that God cares less about our intellectual belief than about our trust. How many times have I pointed out that the Greek word our Bibles translate as belief is absolutely equally translatable as trust. And I believe a lot of things I don't give my heart to, but I trust only that which holds my heart. Marcus Borges many times did historical studies of that word belief and how it used to be understood differently. It used to be understood as be loving, but in the last 150 years or so, it's come to mean what we hold intellectually in our heads. It used to be the assent of our hearts. And if we understand it as trust rather than belief, so it is with us. The book of James says, "You believe that God is one, you do well. Even the demons believe and shudder." Anyone can be intellectually believing, but believing and trusting, that's a much deeper spiritual and relational step. All right, we're already to number 4. Speaking of belief, let's turn to Jesus. I have so many friends who, if they were daring, would call themselves Christian-ish. But they are simply unable to believe in the virgin birth and the physical resurrection. And I try to explain to them that that shouldn't stop them, but it does. Look at the message we inadvertently send. This church is filled to bursting on Christmas Eve and on Easter, right? And those are the days we talk about what? The birth and the resurrection. So they go to church twice a year maybe, that's what they hear. I tell them that's not what it's all about. You really need to stop by one of the other 50 Sundays. Nope, they're not going to do that. And in many churches, they might attend on one of those 2 Sundays. They'll also recite the Apostles' Creed, which we never recite. And maybe you'll come back to that, I don't know. But my problem with the Apostles' Creed, the most common creed of Christianity, which has been with us since the 5th century, is the section about Jesus. It reads like this: I believe in Jesus Christ, God's only Son, our Lord, who was conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead, and buried. The third day he rose from the dead, he ascended into heaven, and sitteth at the right hand of God the Father Almighty. From thence he shall come to judge the quick and the dead, the living and the dead. Where's his life? Where's his teachings? It's all in that tiny little comma in between born of the Virgin Mary and suffered under Pontius Pilate. Of course, if people come to church and that's what they hear, and we tell them, well, we're really about following Jesus, they're going to say, really? Well, where is that in your creed? Or where is that in your art? The creed skips over everything between his birth and his death. So no wonder my friends think that believing in the virgin birth and physical resurrection are the keys of faith, and they reject it. But what did Jesus say about all of this? Well, the community of John thought that he told his followers at their Last Supper together, if you love me, you will what? Keep my commandments. Not believe this about me, not uphold this article of faith about me. Keep my commandments. And what are those commandments? Love God with all your heart, your mind, your soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And who's your neighbor? Anyone who's in need. He didn't mention the circumstances of his birth. He didn't call out the circumstances of his death and pending resurrection. He did not say, worship me. He said, keep my commandments, follow me. In the New Reformation, we are very much more about following Jesus, keeping his commandments, than we are about worrying about his birth or death or trying to put him on a pedestal as an object of worship. And number 5 is like it. While we understand Jesus to have been intimately connected with God, he is not the only figure in history to have been so connected. John 3:16 may say that Jesus is God's only begotten Son, but a more honest translation says uniquely begotten. And besides that, the writers of John likely didn't know about Buddhists or Hindus or practitioners of Native American faiths, let alone have them in mind when they wrote that. For them, Jesus was the extraordinary, unique conduit to God, as Jesus is for me. But I always keep in mind that the Lutheran bishop and theologian, Christopher Stendhal, loved to say, we can sing our love songs to Jesus as long as we don't make everyone else sing along. We can even learn from the songs people of other faiths sing as well, right? Which you'll do if you go to that thing on the 22nd, which I can't encourage enough. All right, that's 5. 6, following Jesus means radically including those whom society excludes. In his time, that meant women, lepers, people struggling with mental illness, people the Jewish faith considered ritually unclean, like tax collectors. I consider it just a travesty and a tragedy that in my time in ministry, Christianity has come to represent to people a faith that judges and excludes. That's the biggest reason my friends won't darken the door of a Christian church, because they believe that it's exclusive and judgmental, and they don't want anything to do with it. In fact, we have lost a number of people from this church who know our church doesn't represent that, but they just can't abide being labeled as Christian anymore and being a part of any of that. In our time, we passed an open and affirming statement that we live and we mean it. We, the members of Cedar Hills United Church of Christ, are a diverse group of people who know the joy of acceptance and affirmation by God and by one another. We are of different ages, educational levels, races, abilities, and sexual orientations, and we need to add gender orientation to that, or gender identity. Because we recognize Jesus' welcoming love of all, and because people of differing sexual orientations are often alienated from church and society, we affirm that every child of God is embraced within our community and is welcomed and encouraged to share in the life, liturgy, and leadership of the congregation. And so it has been ever since we passed this in 2004, and frankly before. A couple years after we passed it, we did some visioning, and one of the things that we asked was, what could we change that would cause you to leave the church? That was number one. If we went back on our open and affirming statement, people would leave the church. No question about it. And today we're working hard on racial justice and inclusion, including people of differing abilities, people who struggle with mental illness. One day we may even get to talk about issues of class. But we recognize that in following Jesus, we're trying to become more and more and more inclusive. Number 7, with apologies to Martin Luther, we believe that faith without following is dead. As the book of James says, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith but you do not have works? Can faith save you? If a brother is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says to him, go in peace, keep warm and eat your fill, and yet you do not supply their bodily needs, what's the good of that? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. But what about that reading from Romans? The righteous are saved by faith alone. Luther, God bless him, took it out of context. He was wrong. When Paul was introducing Jesus to the Gentiles, there was not yet a separate Christian church. You had to become Jewish first, and then you followed Jesus. If you were a man and you had not been Jewish and you became Jewish, what did you have to do? You had to be circumcised. Imagine that as an adult male in a world without painkillers and aspirin, okay? Imagine how that might put a crimp on your new member class. There's this thing you got to do. Every single time that Paul talked about faith alone, within a paragraph, you can look at it, within a paragraph, he was begging the home office in Jerusalem, please, please, please let me receive converts without making them go through the work of circumcision. Every time. And for more on this, you can read from a Lutheran bishop, Krister Stendahl, again. He was Lutheran Bishop of Sweden. He was Dean of Harvard Divinity School, a brilliant, wise man. He wrote the splendid book with the terrible title, Paul Among the Jews and Gentiles. And he's the one that pointed out to me, yeah, Paul was really wrong about this. Faith without works is dead. We follow Jesus, we live out our faith in acts of loving service in what the Jewish people call tikkun olam, the repairing of the world. Our faith is not private, but is embedded in the greater good of the world. Number 8, the Bible is central to our understanding of God, and we take it so seriously that we read it in context. And that's why I get so excited about the Bible background every week that I often jump up and forget the other thing that we had planned. 9, reading the Bible in context tells us that forgiveness of sin is not the Bible's only story, although it is an important story. Sin is not our only story. Ours is also a world of original blessing as well as sin. And 10, God not only forgives us, but liberates us from oppression, brings us home from exile and alienation, enlightens us in our darkness, and holds us in incomprehensible love. If you feel distant from God because right now your story is not that you need forgiveness from sin, know that that is not the only lane on the highway of God's redemptive love. There are macro stories going through the Bible from beginning to end and through all of Jesus' teachings of forgiveness, liberation, homecoming, enlightenment, and love. Something for us at all times on all our paths. Almost done. Number 11. See how quickly this is going? In the New Reformation, we are less worried about getting into heaven than about getting heaven into us. Who was the saint who plaintively said, "Oh, I wish I had an axe to break down the gates of heaven and a bucket of water to douse the fires of hell so that human beings might love God for God's sake alone"? More worried about getting heaven into us. And finally, number 12, up in the attic of our ancestors, as we rummage around, we find holy habits and spiritual practices, and they are bringing us new vitality. We're rediscovering and redeeming ancient spirituality and a focus on practice. We meditate and we do breath prayer and we ring gongs and we practice hospitality and we join in weekly vespers and practice gratitude and nightly examine. Holy habits we're finding in the attic of our faith and dusting off, making our own. And it's bringing us life and vitality and depth and connection with God that we did not previously know. It's an ancient spirituality ever new. Well, you may remember that for a couple of years I opened worship saying that we are proudly progressive and unapologetically Christian. When I said that we are progressive, I mean that we are on this end of the new Reformation. And by Christian, I mean that Jesus is central to our understanding of God. In all of the shifting and sorting of the great garage sale and attic search, we're grounded and guided by Jesus. And we will never, I hope, throw Jesus out with the bathwater, to mix a metaphor. But when I said that we are unapologetically Christian, I have to confess I was thinking about some other UCC churches that aren't so focused on Jesus. I was thinking about Unitarian churches and New Thought churches. We are Christian here. But then one Saturday a couple years ago, I read a long article in the New York Times. Not that it was new to me, but it was just concentrated. It was about the personal and cultural devastation inflicted upon Native American children by missionaries, both Protestant and Roman Catholic. It was just ghastly. And for some reason, I had my sermon done, so I had a free night. Oh, I'll watch a movie. I've never seen Philomena. That sounds fun. Not knowing that Philomena was a movie about the forced labor and forced adoptions in Irish convents in the last century. I was sick to my stomach by the end of that night. I have not said proudly Christian since, but instead, I say we seek to love as Jesus loved, widely and inclusively, and with humility when we miss the mark. That's why I made that switch. Religious scholar Dorothy Butler Bass recently said that the most significant story in the history of religion at this time is not a decline in Western religion. It's not a rejection of religious institutions. It's not the growth of religious extremism. Rather, it's a changed concept of God. It's a rebirthing of faith from the ground up. She ends her latest book saying, "It's time for the church to wake up. There's nothing worse than sleeping through a revolution." It may not happen exactly the way we hope it will. It may not happen in the form we would most love for it to happen in, but it is happening. So I invite us all to continue to wake up and look around. I think we have undergone a reformation here, and may this revolution of spirit and heart grow and spread so that one day again, someday, we may all stand and say together that we are proudly progressive and unapologetically Christian.